It is good to be back with you as we are continuing on through Bible study today. So glad that you are with us. We are in Nehemiah and are throttling through that book towards a conclusion. If you'd like to find out more about this study, the entire reading schedule, and how you can be a part of it, you can visit the URL right there at the bottom of your screen, go.christtable.today/reconstruct. And if you'd like to find out more about Christ Table, the ministry that brings this Bible study as well as other spiritual formation resources to you, both online as well as directly to your home, you can visit www.christtable.today. There, I'd encourage you to sign up for the email list, and if you'd consider donating, we would appreciate that a lot. We're only able to bring these because of your continuing generosity. And in return, we are generous to those who donate regularly by sending physical Bible studies and other resources into your home every couple of months so that you can feed yourself spiritually. And we're always right there alongside of you in order to help. Today, we find ourselves on day 24 in Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 30 through 39. So let's dig in. When we come to today's study, we're kind of in part 2, or maybe even you might say part 3 of a 2 or 3 day study where the people of Israel, specifically though the people of the city of Jerusalem, who have returned from a lengthy captivity, essentially in their words, because of their abandonment of God. Now that they're back in the city, they have built a physical wall, which we've said wasn't really what God intended for them to do, especially because they built the wall to keep people physically away from their God, to kind of, take their toys and say, mine, to take their God and their religion and their faith and say, this is for me, not for you. We find that that is probably not within God's heart, especially here specifically because he's told them this is not the way that I want you to practice your faith and your religion here during this time period. So what they've done, though, is they've realized that they need to do some housekeeping in their spiritual lives, and they've all gathered together to essentially write a document that the entire community can agree upon that will define exactly how they are going to live and behave morally so that they don't get taken into captivity again for abandoning God. Now, yesterday we kind of walked up to the moment where they made those commitments, and today we actually see what those commitments are in verses 30 through 39. And I'm going to start just one verse earlier. They swore a curse on themselves if they failed to obey the law God issued by his servant Moses. They solemnly promised to carefully follow all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord our God. And just for a bit of review, as we said yesterday, the fact that they're doing this was not really a requirement and might actually be counterproductive to take an oath and to commit to something in this way, as God has not asked them to go that far or to do this. And it seems as though it's kind of a one-sided covenant. There are two-sided agreements, covenants, where God also signs on the dotted line in the Bible. The Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant. God seems to be uninvolved here. This is a one-way street. It's something that they're promising, but that God's not signing. I agree to this. And here it is. We promise not to let our daughters marry the pagan people of the land and not to let our sons marry their daughters. So first thing right off out of the gate is a commitment to who they are allowed to marry, intermingle with, and who they are not. We also promise that if the people of the land should bring any merchandise or grain to be sold on the Sabbath or any other holy day, we will refuse to buy it. Every 7th year, we will let our land rest, and we will cancel all of the debts that are owed to us. Now, we've moved beyond just marriage, relationships, love, though in ancient days, love wasn't a necessary part of marriage in a patriarchal society. But we moved now to economics and to religious practice, worship, specifically the Sabbath. In addition, we promise, and I'm going to take a break and hit pause there. I'm actually going to let you read the rest of this in the text from 33 to 39. It dives more deeply into the regulations involving worship, economics, and specifically tithe and sacrifices themselves. So they're going to really get extremely specific on what they are going to give to God in regard to finances, in regard to tithe, in regard to sacrifices and food, and alternatively, obviously, that means what they aren't expected or required to give to God. But I'll say that what they actually do commit to here in these verses it's not puff. It's not fluff. It's not easy peasy. They are really putting into place some extremely stringent and self-disciplined items when it comes to economics, when it comes to marriage and relationships, when it comes to worship, including tithe and sacrifices. They're really laying down the law. The difficulty is here that they already had laws in place that they have sit and listened to as a community in the law of Moses, which is outlined in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. We also know that they have responded to that and now learn their history. And so it wasn't as though there weren't requirements, and it's also not as though this is a distillation. They already had a distillation of those laws and requirements. There are 600 and something laws in the law of Moses, if we count correctly. They already had a distillation of those things. The Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, are a distillation, are a summary of the broader law. So why are they doing this? If you pay attention and compare what they're committing to here to what was in those 600 and something laws, they're actually going further than the letter of the law. They're saying we're going to commit to a more stringent religious law. We're going to commit to a more stringent marriage law. We're going to commit to a more stringent economic and financial law than God has asked us to do, which sounds super religious and super wonderful. It's like, if you in a family or in a work as an employer or maybe as a teacher with a student, if you ask them to set their boundaries here and to kind of live and obey within these guidelines, and then if they kind of close that in and say, well, you asked me to set my bedtime at 11 p.m., but I'm going to go to bed at 10 p.m. You asked me to be up by 8. I'm going to be up by 7. You asked me as a teacher to study for an hour. I'm going to study for an hour and a half. You asked me to do only 10 problems on this 20 problem homework assignment. I'm going to do 15 or the full 20. You asked me to commit to getting a sales number of X number of dollars every month. Well, I'm actually going to commit to doing X number of dollars and then an additional 20% above that every month. Oftentimes, that communicates to us this person is serious, and this person is also a better child, a better student, a better employee. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not that is true in those worlds, but I will say that in the religious world, that's a recipe for disaster. We have a word for that, and that is ultra-legalism. It's fundamentalism. I'm going to not just adhere to what God has asked me to do, but I'm going to do more. I'm going to narrow those boundaries. And what they're doing here is they're narrowing it for everyone. And that's what happens in legalism and in fundamentalism is you don't end up being the only one who adheres to those things. You end up expecting others to adhere to those things, and then you start believing that God actually expects that out of you. And if God expects that out of you, then God expects that out of them as well. Here's the deal. Going further than God doesn't bring you closer to God. Now think about that for just a minute. Going beyond what God has asked doesn't actually bring you closer to doing what God has asked. It takes you farther away. The further you go beyond where God has asked you to go, the farther away from Him. Is it further or farther? I always get those two mixed up. You can tell me in the comments. It doesn't bring you closer to Him. It takes you further away. So in 30 through 39 in our text for today, they're not actually bringing themselves closer to God by committing to a more stringent set of practices and guidelines. They're actually taking themselves further away from Him. God had put in place in the law some requirements, some guidelines for them for who they should marry and who they shouldn't. What they're committing to here is actually more stringent. God had put in place guidelines for the Sabbath so that it would be remembered, so it would be kept holy, so that they would not avoid rest each and every week, and space for reflection. What they commit to here goes beyond that. God had requests, guidelines for them, and how they should be generous, how they should take care of their priests, of the Levites, of the temple workers. What they're committing to here goes beyond that, is more stringent. That doesn't make them holier. That doesn't actually make God love them more. It's going to become a wedge between them and God because they're doing more than they need to do, more than they have to do, and more than they should do. It's going to be counterproductive. And it ends, we promise together not to neglect the temple of our God. I think that this is telling in that almost all of these circle back in some way to the temple of God. There was a fascination, if not an infatuation, with the temple of God. The temple of God was, you have to kind of think differently about their religion and their houses of worship than we do ours. We go to church, to a cathedral, to experience worship or mass, and we say sometimes that we feel God's presence there. But there is no sense in Christianity that God's presence is contained within a building of any kind. You know, there's more weight in the theology of God is everywhere, God is in us, God is maybe more present there. We might feel, we might say, but we wouldn't say that God is contained to that space or is only present there. In their system of worship, God's presence was physically in the temple. The only way that you could interact with God was to be physically at the temple. The sacrifices take place at the temple. God's presence, the Holy of Holies, is in the temple. Once a year, the priest, the high priest, would go into the holiest room, the Holy of Holies, once a year in order to seek forgiveness and absolution of the sins of the entire community. Once a year, one person was physically said to be in the presence of God because God's presence was contained to that room and to that space. So the temple of God becomes the only way for any individual to interact with God. What they're doing here is continuing to build walls between those whom they see as being outsiders and God. Now, what they're doing is they're saying not only is our tactic going to be to build a physical wall around the temple to keep out the pagans, now we are going to build other walls, moral laws, relational laws, worship and economic laws in order to keep people out of the presence of God, to keep others away from God. This is abuse to the mind, to the heart of God, and it's not okay. Never build walls between God and between other people. We do this in a lot of ways. One of the ways in which I currently see this happen a lot in the world is this idea that we have to tell people where they have violated God's law, where they are wrong. And if we don't do that, then somehow or other we are failing in our commitment and our responsibility to other people. That is building a wall rather than a bridge. It's putting people in a prison that they must change who they are before they can come and sit at the table. We forget that we are just as broken, that we have just as many, if not more, problems. We avoid and ignore our own issues. But since we think on the inside, we build this wall to keep other people who we don't like on the outside. Here's the difficulty. When we build a wall between God and others, to insulate ourselves, to barricade ourselves inside with God, what we find out is God was never on the inside with us. He's on the outside with them. You see, they built this temple to house God. They built physical walls and then went steps further to build other walls, metaphorically, between them and between others, thinking that they could keep inside of all of these systems, all of these laws, all these walls with God themselves because he was there in the temple. And the truth was God was outside. And the wall they built between God and others was actually a wall between themselves and God. We see this play out in the New Testament. And the religious leaders decrying Jesus for spending time with prostitutes, tax collectors, and other disreputable sinners. God was on the outside. And yet the insiders were building walls that they thought was keeping others out, but was actually keeping them away from God. Build bridges, build tables, tear down walls. Till next time, happy reading.